He was handing out free coffee and donuts to the people he was robbing, and they were lining up to thank him. It's a hot morning in the summer of 1920, on School Street in downtown Boston, and the sidewalk has disappeared under bodies. Thousands of them, shoulder to shoulder, some shoving money at him, some trying to claw money back, all of them shouting. And weaving through the middle of it, calm as a Sunday, is a small, beaming man with a tray. Barely 5'2", straw hat, gold-handled cane, a diamond stick-pin at his throat, and a fresh flower in his lapel. He pats shoulders. He cracks jokes. He tells the frightened ones there is nothing to worry about. And it works. People who came to demand their savings back change their minds and hand him more. A year earlier, this man had holes in his shoes. Today he owns a mansion with a heated pool, a chauffeur, a controlling stake in a bank, and the life savings of tens of thousands of people. At his peak, the money is coming in faster than his clerks can physically count it. Close to $1 million a day, crammed into desk drawers and wastebaskets because there is nowhere else to put it. 3/4 of the Boston police force have given him their money. So has his own chauffeur. So has a banker in Kansas who mailed him $10,000 sight unseen. And there is nothing behind the smile. No business, no real investment. The brilliant financial secret that every person in that crowd believes he has discovered does not exist. By the private verdict of the publicist he hired himself, the great financier can barely add. What he actually has is one slip of paper, a story about post-it coupons that almost no one in Boston understands, and the most dangerous charm in America. His name is Charles Ponzi, and every single dollar of it is a lie. Within weeks, that lie will collapse and drag 6 banks and tens of thousands of families down with it. He will be exposed, arrested, convicted, and shipped out of the country in disgrace. He will die in a charity ward on the far side of the world with $75 to his name. But that is not the strangest part. The strangest part is what America did next. It did something it had never done for any swindler before him, and has never quite done since. It took his name, the name this penniless immigrant had crossed an ocean to make great, and it turned that name into a word, the word we still reach for, 100 years later, in every language on earth, for the oldest and most seductive lie in the history of money, a Ponzi scheme. He wanted, more than anything on earth, to make his family name immortal. He got his wish. He just never got to choose what for. So who was he? The straw hat was only his last costume. Before it, he was a dishwasher who slept on the floor of the restaurant that employed him. A convicted forger, a smuggler, a man who once let surgeons cut the skin from his own back to save a stranger he barely knew. He built the most famous fraud in history on a foundation of absolutely nothing. And then, dying and broke, he called the whole thing the best show ever staged. To understand how one small man pulled it off, and why a version of him is emptying someone's savings account at this very moment, you have to go back to the beginning. To a proud, ruined family in Italy, and a boy raised to believe he was born for something extraordinary. He was. He just never imagined what. Chapter 1. The Boy from Lugo. On the 3rd of March, 1882, in the town of Lugo, in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy, a boy was born and given a name almost comically larger than the infant who carried it. Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi. 5 names, a name built for an aristocrat, a name that expected great things, and that expectation was the whole problem, because the Ponzi family, by the time Carlo arrived, was living almost entirely on the memory of what it used to be. The story they told, the story Carlo would repeat for the rest of his life, sometimes moving the details around to suit the moment, was that they had once been people of standing, well-to-do, respectable. Later, he'd tell reporters he came from Parma, from good stock, from a lineage that had money and manners and mattered. His mother clung to this past with both hands. She still used the honorific Donna, a title reserved for ladies of noble blood, long after there was any noble income left to justify it. There's something heartbreaking in that, if you let yourself see it. A woman insisting on being addressed like an aristocrat while the family fortune had already evaporated. A household where the silverware might be gone but the bearing remained. Where you were taught that you were better than your circumstances. that this poverty was temporary, an insult, a mistake that a clever enough Ponzi would one day correct. Carlo absorbed that lesson down to his bones. He grew up, as he'd later describe it himself, with a champagne appetite and a lemonade income, and by his own account, he never once considered that the solution might be to lower the appetite. Everyone who later knew him remarked on the same traits, that he was quick, charming, funny, and carried a near physical aversion to honest, grinding, low-paid labor. From everything we know of his youth, those traits were there from the very start, in a boy of his class in 1890s Italy who had been raised to believe such work was beneath him. He wanted the good life, the café life, the opera, the tailored suits and the easy money. He wanted to arrive at a station in society, not to earn his way there one dull lira at a time. For a while, it looked like education might be his ladder. He took a job early on as a postal worker, a small, respectable civil service position, and, as it happens, his first brush with the world of stamps and coupons and international postage that would one day make him famous. But the postal job was never the dream. The dream was the University of Rome La Sapienza, one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Europe, and against real odds, Carlo got in. This should have been the turning point, the moment the clever, ambitious boy from the fallen family climbs back up. And it was a turning point, just not the kind anyone hoped for. Because at university, Carlo Ponzi fell in with a crowd of young men who were everything he wanted to be and nothing he could afford to be. Rich boys. Boys with allowances and family estates and no particular need to graduate. To them, the university wasn't a path to a career. One of them reportedly called it a 4-year vacation. And Carlo, desperate to belong, desperate to be seen as one of them, followed them everywhere. To the bars, to the cafes, to the opera. He spent money he didn't have to keep up with people he could never keep up with. You can guess how it ended. 4 years later, Carlo Ponzi walked out of the University of Rome exactly the way he'd arrive at nearly every enterprise for the rest of his life. Broke, with nothing to show for it, and utterly undiminished in his conviction that he was still, somehow, destined for greatness. He had no degree, he had no money, he had no prospects. What he had was a family back home who still believed in the myth of the great Ponzi name, and who were watching other Italian families experience something like a miracle. Because all across Italy in those years, a legend was spreading. A legend called America. Young men were leaving, sons of farmers and shopkeepers and clerks, boarding ships bound for New York and Boston with nothing in their pockets. And some of them, a few years later, were coming back in good coats. Coming back with American dollars, which in the devastated Italian economy were worth a small fortune. Coming back with stories of a country where the streets, people whispered, were paved with gold, and where a man could rise as high and as fast as his own nerve could carry him. For a family living on the fumes of former glory, this was intoxicating, and for Carlo Ponzi, a young man with expensive tastes, no money, an unshakable sense of his own destiny, and absolutely no other plan, it was the answer to everything. His family scraped together what they could. They bought him passage. The idea was simple, the same idea 100,000 Italian families were pinning their hopes on. Go to America, get rich, come home, and restore the name. He would only ever manage 2 out of 4. He went to America, and he made the name immortal. He just never came home. And rich would turn out to be the most temporary condition of his entire life. Chapter 2. $2.50. On the 15th of November, 1903, a ship called the SS Vancouver eased into Boston Harbor, and among the crowd of hopeful immigrants pressed against the rail was a 21-year-old Carlo Ponzi, staring at the new world and carrying, in the entire universe of his possessions, the sum of $2.50. That was it, $2.50. In today's money, somewhere around $90. Enough for a couple of restaurant meals and not much else. His family had sent him off with considerably more than that. They'd given him enough to actually get started, enough to find that distant relative, enough to begin the great American adventure with at least a little cushion under him. So what happened to the rest of it? He gambled it away. On the ship, during the crossing, somewhere on the Atlantic, between the old world and the new, Carlo Ponzi sat down at a card table with money that represented his family's hopes and his own future, and by his own later admission, he lost it. All of it, more or less. You can picture it easily enough. Every hand a small bet that this next one would be the one that made him. It's the most perfectly Ponzi thing imaginable, arriving at the doorstep of the land of opportunity, having already thrown away his stake on a long shot, still absolutely certain the good times were about to start. And here is what tells you everything about the man. He never treated this as a warning. Years later, telling the story to a reporter for the New York Times, he didn't frame it as a cautionary tale or a moment of shame. He framed it as charming, as destiny. "I landed in this country with $2.50 in cash," he said, "and $1 million in hopes. And those hopes never left me. 1 million in hopes. There it is, the entire philosophy of Charles Ponzi in a single sentence. The books didn't matter. The balance didn't matter. What mattered was the size of the dream and the intensity of the belief. That was the currency he actually traded in for his whole life. Not dollars. Hope. His own and, eventually, everybody else's. But hope doesn't buy dinner. And the America that greeted Carlo Ponzi in the winter of 1903 was not the golden fantasy of the Italian countryside. It was cold, it was crowded, it was suspicious of Italians, who were pouring into eastern cities by the hundreds of thousands and were widely regarded, by the established Anglo-American population, as dirty, criminal, and beneath contempt. There was no relative waiting with a cushy job. There was no gold in the gutters. There was just a young man who spoke almost no English, had no trade, no money, no connections, and a bottomless conviction that he was too good for whatever work he could actually get. So he did the work anyway, because he was starving. He drifted up and down the East Coast for the next several years, taking whatever he could find, the kind of rotating menu of low-wage work that immigrants of the era survived on. Clerking, factory labor, odd jobs of every description, none of them lasting, most of them beneath the dignity he still imagined he possessed. He learned English fast, which was the one genuine asset he built in those years, and he learned it well enough to charm, which mattered more than anyone knew yet. At his lowest, he took a job as a dishwasher in a restaurant, and it's worth staying on this image, because it's the exact opposite of the man on School Street with the straw hat and the donuts. The future millionaire, the future name of a crime, scrubbing grease off plates in a hot back kitchen for pennies, and sleeping, because he couldn't afford a room, on the floor of the restaurant. On the floor. That's how far down the great Ponzi name had traveled. He clawed his way up from dishwasher to waiter, which was a real promotion. Waiters got tips, waiters faced the customers, waiters used charm. And charm, Ponzi had in abundance. But he had something else in abundance too. And this is the first real crack in the story, where you see what he was going to become. He got fired. And he got fired for two specific things: theft and shortchanging the customers. That phrase is the whole future in miniature. Shortchanging the customers. Taking a bill, handing back less change than was owed, and pocketing the difference. Betting that the mark won't check, won't notice, won't do the arithmetic. It is, in the smallest and pettiest possible form, exactly what he would one day do to an entire city. A man who couldn't be trusted to make correct change for a plate of spaghetti would, some 15 years later, be trusted with the life savings of 3/4 of the Boston police force. But that was still far away. For now, he'd been thrown out of a waiter's job in disgrace, and America had thoroughly failed to pave a single street with gold on his behalf. By 1907, 4 years in, Carlo Ponzi had achieved precisely nothing that he'd come for. So he did what he would always do when a place ran out of chances. He left. He went north, across the border, to Montreal, to a bustling French and Italian city where a distant cousin of the American dream was waiting. And it was there, in a small immigrant bank on a street called St. Jacques, that Charles Ponzi went to school. Not a university this time, a far more useful education. He was about to watch, up close and in real time, exactly how you could steal a fortune from trusting people using nothing but confidence and other people's money. He was taking notes. He just didn't know it yet. Chapter 3. The Education of a Con Man. The bank was called Banco Zerosi, and it had been opened by a man named Luigi Zerosi, Louis, to his customers, specifically to serve the flood of Italian immigrants arriving in Montreal. These were people who didn't trust the big English-speaking banks, didn't understand the paperwork, and wanted to put their money somewhere run by a man who spoke their language and shared their faith. Zerosi gave them exactly that. Ponzi walked in looking for work, and he was, on paper, a perfect hire. He now spoke 3 languages: Italian, English, and the French of Quebec. He was quick with numbers, and he had that easy, likable manner that put nervous depositors at ease. Zerosi took him on as an assistant teller. Ponzi was good at it. He rose. Before long, he was effectively managing the place, and that's when he saw it. The trick. The whole beautiful, rotten machine. Zerosi's bank was booming, and everybody could see why. It paid 6% interest on deposits. 6%. At a time when the going rate elsewhere was maybe half that. Money poured in. Because why would you put your savings anywhere else when this friendly Italian bank paid double? Zerosi looked like a genius. He looked like a pillar of the community. He looked rich. He was, in fact, drowning, because 6% was impossible. Zerosi had made a pile of bad real estate loans that were never coming back, and the interest he owed his depositors was murdering him. There was no legitimate profit anywhere in the operation that could pay that 6%. So where was the money coming from? From the new depositors. That was the secret. Every time a new immigrant walked in and opened an account, Zerosi took that fresh deposit and used it to pay the interest he owed to the earlier depositors. He was, in the oldest phrase for the oldest trick, robbing Peter to pay Paul, taking money from new investors to pay fake profits to old ones, and calling the whole thing a bank. Young Charles Ponzi watched this happen from the inside. He saw how it worked. He saw how well it worked, for a while. And it's hard not to conclude that somewhere in that Montreal bank, a lesson lodged itself permanently in his mind, because he would reproduce it so precisely a decade later. You can pay yesterday's promises with today's deposits, and as long as tomorrow's deposits keep coming, no one will ever know the difference. Whether he understood it that clearly at the time or only in hindsight, the blueprint of his entire future was sitting right there in front of him. He also learned the second, darker half of the lesson. Because tomorrow's deposits don't keep coming forever. The bad loans caught up with Zerosi. The bank buckled, and when the end came, Louis Zerosi did not stay to face the ruined families. He grabbed as much of the remaining cash as he could carry, and he fled, reportedly to Mexico, leaving behind wreckage, furious depositors, and a wife and children he simply abandoned. This is where the Ponzi story takes one of its genuinely strange turns, the kind that makes him impossible to reduce to a cartoon villain. Ponzi didn't run. He stayed in Montreal. He was broke, since Zerosi hadn't exactly left him a severance, and yet he moved in with Zerosi's abandoned family and tried to help them. The wife, the children, deserted by the crook who'd caused it all, and the man who stayed to look after them was the future king of crooks himself. Ponzi was, all his life, this maddening contradiction, capable of real, spontaneous, useless generosity, and equally capable of robbing everyone in sight, sometimes practically at the same time. But good intentions don't pay rent, and Ponzi was desperate. He needed money to get back to the United States and start over. And this is where he made the leap from watching a crime to committing one. He walked into the offices of a company called Canadian Warehousing, a former Zerosi customer. Nobody was there. On a desk, he found a company checkbook, and Charles Ponzi sat down, wrote himself a check for $423.58, and forged the signature of one of the company's directors, a man named Damien Fournier. It was not a clever crime. He cashed the check and then immediately, conspicuously, started spending the money. New clothes, the works, in a city where the police were already watching for exactly this kind of thing. They connected the sudden spending to the forged check almost instantly. When the officers confronted him, Ponzi didn't bluster, didn't run, didn't lawyer up. He simply held out his wrist for the handcuffs and said 2 words, "I'm guilty." He was sentenced to 3 years, and he served them as inmate number 6660 in the grim St. Vincent de Paul Federal Penitentiary on the edge of Montreal. And even here, Locked in a bleak Canadian prison for forgery, the essential Ponzi refused to die. He could not bear for his mother back in Italy to know the truth. So he wrote her a letter, and in that letter he told her that he had found excellent employment. He'd landed a fine position, he wrote, as a special assistant to the prison's warden. It's almost funny. It's almost sad. A man in a cell, inventing a flattering fiction about that exact cell, because the myth of the great Ponzi name mattered more to him than the truth of his own life. He was already, at 26, a man who preferred the beautiful lie to the ugly fact, not just for his marks, but for the people he loved, and even for himself. He got out in 1911, and almost immediately he found a way back into a cell and into the single most important education of his criminal life. Chapter 4. Atlanta, the University of Crime. Freed from the Canadian penitentiary, Ponzi pointed himself south, back toward the United States, back toward the country that had beaten him, but that he still couldn't stop believing in. And on the way, he got involved in a scheme that tells you he had learned exactly nothing about staying out of trouble, and everything about where the money was. He got mixed up in smuggling Italian immigrants across the border into the United States, illegally, for a fee. It made a certain grim sense. There were countless Italians desperate to get into America. Immigration was tightening, and a man who spoke the language and knew both sides of the border could make money moving human beings through the cracks. It was also a federal crime, and Ponzi, being Ponzi, got caught. This time there was no friendly Canadian penitentiary. This time he was sentenced to 2 years in the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, a serious federal prison, holding serious men. And it was inside those walls that Charles Ponzi received the education that university and the Montreal Bank had only begun. Atlanta was his graduate school, and he had 2 remarkable professors. The first was a man named Ignazio Lupo, Lupo the Wolf, one of the most feared mafia figures in America, a man convicted in connection with a massive counterfeiting operation, a man whose very name made people in the New York underworld go quiet. The prison warden knew Lupo was dangerous and was secretly intercepting his mail, trying to catch him coordinating crime from behind bars. But the letters were in Italian, so the warden needed a translator, someone smart, someone trustworthy seeming, someone who spoke the language. He picked Ponzi. And Ponzi, translating the private correspondence of a mafia boss for the warden, seems to have done something very Ponzi. Rather than simply informing on Lupo, he used the arrangement to get close to him. By the accounts that survive, he befriended the wolf, made himself agreeable to one of the most powerful criminals in the country. Nothing suggests it turned Ponzi into a gangster. Violence was never his instrument, then or later. But it's reasonable to think the experience taught him something about how power and fear and reputation operated among men who simply took what they wanted. The second professor mattered far more. His name was Charles W. Morse. Morse was not a gangster. In a way, he was worse. Morse was a respectable criminal, a Wall Street financier and speculator, a man who had manipulated markets and built and wrecked fortunes, a genuine tycoon who had finally overreached and landed in federal prison. And to Charles Ponzi, this ruined Wall Street wolf was not a cautionary tale. He was a hero, a role model, the living proof that a clever man in a good suit could play with millions of other people's dollars and be admired for it. And Morse taught Ponzi the most valuable trick he'd ever learn, not about finance, but about performance. Morse desperately wanted out of prison, and he engineered his release through an astonishing act of sustained fraud. During his medical examinations, he made himself appear to be a dying man. How? He ate soap. Shavings of soap, swallowed before the doctors examined him, which produced symptoms alarming enough to convince trained physicians that he was gravely, terminally ill. It worked. Morse conned the doctors, conned the system, and walked out of prison a supposedly dying man. Then, of course, made a full and miraculous recovery once he was free. It's not hard to guess the lesson Ponzi took from watching this. Not crime doesn't pay, but something closer to reality is whatever you can convince people it is. Morse's actual health hadn't mattered, only the health the doctors believed they saw, and a man's actual finances, one might extend, would matter far less than the finances the public believed they saw. If you could control the performance, you could bend the truth. Morse ate soap to fake death. Ponzi would one day hand out coffee and donuts to fake solvency. It's the same move, and it's tempting, looking back, to trace a straight line from the one professor to the other. Ponzi finished his term after Morse walked free, and in a final, almost poetic humiliation, had an extra month tacked onto his sentence because he couldn't pay a $50 fine. $50. The man who would soon be pulling in $250,000 a day sat in prison an extra month because he didn't have $50. When the gates finally opened, Charles Ponzi was in his early 30s. He had been to prison in 2 countries. He had learned forgery, smuggling, the mechanics of robbing Peter to pay Paul, the psychology of fear from a mafia boss, and the art of pure performance from a Wall Street conman. He had, without ever intending to, completed the perfect curriculum for the crime he was about to commit. All he needed now was an idea, a city, and a reason to try to become respectable. He was about to find all 3, and the reason came first, and her name was Rose. Chapter 5. Rose and the Man Who Gave Away His Own Skin. Out of prison and back in the United States, Ponzi drifted again, chasing work the way he always had. And in this stretch of his life, the years just before the storm, something happens that complicates the whole picture, something that makes it genuinely hard to file Charles Ponzi under the simple heading of monster. He took a job at a mining camp, working as a nurse. And while he was there, another nurse, a woman named Pearl, was horribly burned in an accident. She needed skin grafts to survive. Ponzi barely knew her. There was no advantage to him in what he did next. No scheme, no angle, no mark to work. He simply volunteered. He went under the knife, twice, and allowed surgeons to remove a large expanse of skin, by some accounts more than 100 square inches, from his own back and legs, to graft onto a near stranger. It nearly killed him. The operations left him with pleurisy and serious complications, and he was laid up so badly that he lost the job. He gave the skin off his own body to save a woman he hardly knew, and it cost him his livelihood, and as far as we can tell, he never once tried to profit from the story. That image matters for understanding the real tragedy of this man. He was not incapable of goodness, and he was not a hollow psychopath who felt nothing. He was something rarer and sadder, a man who could be genuinely, recklessly kind, and genuinely, recklessly dishonest, and who never seemed to notice the contradiction. The same impulse that made him give away his skin, the craving to be the hero of the story, the big man, the generous benefactor, was the exact same impulse that would later make him hand out donuts to people he was ruining. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He wanted to be adored. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where all the damage lived. Recovered and restless, Ponzi eventually made his way back to Boston, and there, in the ordinary bustle of the immigrant city, he met the person who would anchor whatever was left of his decent self, a young stenographer named Rose Maria Ginecco. Rose came from an Italian-American family that ran a small fruit stall in downtown Boston. She was pretty, practical, warm, and completely without guile, in almost every way the opposite of the man courting her. And Ponzi courted her hard. He was, when he wanted to be, irresistible, funny, attentive, brimming with plans and optimism, a small man who made a woman feel like the whole world was about to open up. He proposed. She said yes. There was, of course, one small matter he neglected to mention: the prison time. 2 countries worth of it. Rose had no idea she was marrying a convicted forger and smuggler. Ponzi simply left that part out, the beautiful lie again, the curated version of himself. But the truth had a way of arriving in the mail. Ponzi's own mother, back in Italy, apparently couldn't bear the deception, and she wrote to Rose directly, telling the young woman the truth about her son's past. Imagine receiving that letter. The mother of your fiancé, writing to warn you about her own child. And Rose married him anyway. In 1918, knowing what she now knew, she married Charles Ponzi. Whether it was love, or faith, or the simple conviction that people can change, she cast her lot with him, and she would stand by him with astonishing loyalty through the rise, the collapse, the trials, and years of imprisonment, longer than almost anyone would have blamed her for. Now married, now with a wife to provide for and a family name of his own to think about, Ponzi threw himself at legitimate business with everything he had. And this is the part people forget. Before the great scheme, Charles Ponzi genuinely, repeatedly tried to make it honestly. He worked at his father-in-law's grocery. He took a job with an import-export firm. He took over his wife's family's struggling fruit company and tried to turn it around. And he cooked up a plan to sell advertising in a big business directory that would be mailed out to companies. Every single one of them failed. The grocery went nowhere, the fruit company collapsed, and the advertising directory, his own idea, his own business, couldn't attract enough customers and folded fast. Ponzi was a brilliant salesman with a fatal weakness. He could sell anything except a thing that actually, boringly worked. Legitimate business is slow. It's incremental. It rewards patience, and Ponzi had none. He wanted the fortune now, the way he'd wanted it his whole life. And so, in the summer of 1919, a defeated but undefeated Charles Ponzi sat in a small rented office at 27 School Street in Boston, surrounded by the ruins of his latest failed business idea, trying to figure out his next move. And then a letter arrived from Spain, an ordinary business letter, and tucked inside it was a small, unremarkable slip of paper that most people would have thrown straight into the wastebasket. Charles Ponzi did not throw it away. He looked at it, and a bell, the same bell that had rung in that Montreal bank a decade earlier, began, very quietly, to ring. Chapter 6. The Coupon. The slip of paper was called an international reply coupon. And to understand the scheme that was about to conquer Boston, you have to understand this dull little object, because Ponzi's entire empire was built on top of it, or rather, built on top of a story about it. An international reply coupon solved a small, practical problem. Say you live in the United States, and you want to write to someone in Italy, and you want to make it easy for them to write back, including paying for their return postage, so it costs them nothing to reply. How do you send postage across a border when American stamps are useless in Italy and Italian stamps are useless in America? The answer, worked out by international postal agreement, was the reply, coupon. You'd buy one of these coupons in your own country, mail it to your correspondent abroad, and they could walk into their own post office and exchange that coupon for stamps, enough to cover the postage of a reply. It was a clever, boring solution to a small, practical problem. A way of prepaying someone else's return postage across national lines. But there was a crack in the system, and Ponzi spotted it. A real one. These coupons were priced based on the cost of postage in the country where you bought them, but they could be redeemed for the cost of postage in the country where you cashed them in. And in 1919, thanks to the First World War, the cost of postage in different countries, measured in real terms, in exchangeable currency, had wildly diverged. The war had wrecked the economies of Europe. Currencies like the Italian lira had collapsed against the U.S. dollar. Postage that cost almost nothing in devastated, inflation-ravaged Italy could be redeemed for American stamps worth many times more. So here was the theory. You take a small amount of American money. You send it to an agent in Italy, where the currency has cratered. That agent buys a huge pile of reply coupons for next to nothing, because Italian postage is dirt cheap in dollar terms. He ships the coupons back to you in America, and you walk into a U.S. post office and redeem each one for American stamps worth far more than you paid. Buy low in a weak currency, sell high in a strong one. Ponzi did the arithmetic, or claimed to, and announced that the profit on these transactions, after all the exchange rate conversions, ran to more than 400%. 400%. And this is what made the story so seductive and so dangerous. The idea was not, in itself, illegal. What Ponzi had described was arbitrage, buying an asset cheaply in one market and selling it for more in another. Arbitrage is the beating heart of legitimate finance. Traders do it every day, in currencies and commodities and stocks, and it's perfectly legal. On paper, in principle, Charles Ponzi had spotted a genuine imbalance in the international postal system. If he had simply done it, quietly, at scale, with his own money, he might have made a modest, legal profit and vanished into history as a footnote. But that was never who he was. Ponzi didn't want a modest, legal, incremental profit. He wanted a fortune, and he wanted it now. And he didn't have the capital to buy coupons in the kind of volume that would make him rich. So he did what he'd watched Louis Zerossi do in Montreal. He decided to raise the money from the public. He went to the banks first, including the Hanover Trust Company, and asked them to lend him capital for his brilliant coupon scheme. They turned him down flat. A manager named Henry Chmielewski looked at this ex-con with the wild story about poster coupons and said no. Fine, Ponzi decided. If the banks won't fund it, the people will. He would set up a company and invite ordinary people to invest, and he would offer them a return so spectacular that they couldn't say no. He would offer them 50% profit in 45 days, or, if they preferred, 100%, a doubling of their money, in 90 days. In 1920, that promise was almost obscene. A bank paid you maybe 5% on your savings, per year. Ponzi was offering to double your money in 3 months. It was so far beyond anything the ordinary financial world offered that it should have been unbelievable. And to a few skeptics, it was. But Ponzi had an answer for the skeptics, and it was a beautiful answer, because it contained a kernel of truth. The coupons, he'd explain, leaning back, radiating confidence. The postal coupons. There's an imbalance in the international system, left over from the war, and I've found it. And it generates enormous, legal, legitimate profit. I'm not gambling your money. I'm harvesting a loophole. It sounded technical and plausible, and exactly like the kind of clever, hidden, sophisticated thing that a genuinely brilliant financier might discover, and that an ordinary person could never quite check. That was the genius of it. Not the coupon, the story about the coupon, a story just complicated enough that no one wanted to admit they didn't fully understand it, and just plausible enough that wanting to believe it felt reasonable. In January of 1920, Ponzi gave the story a name. He called his new company the Securities Exchange Company, a grand, solid, trustworthy-sounding name for what was, at that moment, one small man, one rented office, and one slip of paper from Spain. 18 people invested that first month. Together, they handed Charles Ponzi $1,800. He had no idea, nobody did, that he had just lit the fuse on the fastest, strangest financial explosion the country had ever seen. Chapter 7. The Machine. 18 investors. $1,800. That's how it started, in January 1920. And then Ponzi did the one thing that turns a promise into a legend. He paid them. Every one of those first 18 investors, when their notes came due, got exactly what they'd been promised, their money back, plus that staggering profit. 50%, on time, in cash. No excuses, no delays, no fine print. Where did that profit come from? Not from postal coupons. Ponzi hadn't redeemed any meaningful quantity of coupons at all. The money he paid to the first investors came from the second batch of investors. That was the entire machine, the same machine he'd watched grind in Montreal. You take Paul's money and hand it to Peter, and you call it profit, and Peter, thrilled, astonished, suddenly a believer, goes and tells everyone he knows. And that's exactly what happened, because people who get paid impossible returns do not stay quiet about it. The first investors became Ponzi's unpaid sales force, the most powerful marketing engine ever devised. They weren't running on faith. They had proof, cash in hand, real American dollars they could show the neighbors. When your brother-in-law hands you $500 in profit he made in 6 weeks, you don't ask to see the audited books. You ask how you can get in. Word tore through Boston like fire through dry grass. The numbers that follow are almost hard to believe, and the shape of the growth is the whole story. Between February and March of 1920, the total amount invested in the Securities Exchange Company rose from about $5,000 to about $25,000, a 5-fold jump in a month. Ponzi took the money and moved to a bigger office, in the Niles building on School Street. He hired agents, salesmen who fanned out across New England and down into New Jersey, drumming up new investors, and he paid them generous commissions to do it, which of course only accelerated the inflow. Every agent had a personal incentive to bring in more Pauls to pay the Peters. By May of 1920, Ponzi had taken in around $420,000, in today's money, several million. By June, the total investment poured into his scheme had reached $2.5 million, and by July, at the absolute peak, Charles Ponzi was approaching $1 million a day. A day. Money was arriving faster than his clerks could count it. They stuffed it into desk drawers, into wastebaskets, into closets. There are accounts of cash literally overflowing the furniture because there was physically no time to process it all. On a single strong day, he was reportedly pulling in $250,000, roughly the price of a Boston mansion, arriving every 24 hours, in the hands of people who trusted a man who couldn't make correct change as a waiter 15 years earlier. Ponzi opened branch offices. His operations stretched from Maine to New Jersey. And this was the mechanism that kept the whole thing so stable, right up until the moment it wasn't. Most people didn't take their money out. Why would they? If your investment doubles every 90 days, cashing out is madness. You reinvest. You roll it over. You tell Ponzi to keep it working. Investors mortgaged their homes and poured the proceeds in. They emptied their savings accounts. They handed over the money they'd set aside for their children, for their old age, for the trip back to the old country, because 5% a year at the bank was for suckers, and Ponzi was doubling money every quarter. And because they reinvested, Ponzi rarely had to actually pay anyone out. The obligations just kept rolling forward, growing on paper, while the cash, real, spendable cash, kept flooding in. To the investors, their fortunes were multiplying. To Ponzi, it was an ocean of other people's money, with almost nothing flowing back out. For a few intoxicating months, it must have felt like he'd actually done it, like he'd found the philosopher's stone, like the $2.50 immigrant had finally become the millionaire he'd always known he was destined to be. There was just one small, catastrophic problem buried under the whole glittering structure. The coupons were a fiction, not a small one, a total one, and the arithmetic under the story was worse than shaky. It was impossible, and a handful of people were about to pick up their pencils and prove it. But before they did, before the reckoning, Boston had to lose its collective mind. And it did. Chapter 8. Boston Goes Mad. To understand what happened to Boston in the summer of 1920, you have to understand that this stopped being a financial event and became something closer to a religious revival. Ponzi wasn't an investment. He was a phenomenon. He was hope you could hold in your hand. It started, appropriately, with the immigrants, people like Ponzi himself, Italian laborers, dock workers, seamstresses, the working poor of the North End, who had crossed an ocean for a better life, and had mostly found grinding work and casual contempt. To them, Ponzi was more than a way to make money. He was one of them, an Italian who'd made it, letting his own people in on the secret the rich Yankees kept for themselves. Investing with Ponzi was an act of ethnic pride as much as greed. But money that doubles doesn't respect class lines for long. The news traveled upward. Soon the well-to-do wanted in, the established Boston Brahmins, the old money families, the sophisticated people who supposedly knew better. They invested too. Doctors, lawyers, businessmen. The line outside his office was a cross-section of the entire city, top to bottom. And then there's the detail that, more than any other, tells you how completely Boston surrendered its judgment. Nearly 3/4 of the Boston police force is said to have invested in Ponzi's scheme. The police. The very people whose job it was to catch swindlers had handed their savings to the biggest swindler in the city's history. When the cops are in, who's left to be suspicious? Ponzi let everyone in. He was gloriously indiscriminate. Newspaper boys brought him a few dollars in coins, and he took it and gave them a note like everyone else. A banker from Lawrence, Kansas, a man whose entire profession was assessing risk, sent $10,000. Ponzi's own chauffeur, a man named John Collins, invested. His own brother-in-law invested. The people closest to him, the people who saw him every day, believed in him as completely as the strangers in the street. That's not the behavior of a man everyone secretly suspected. That's the behavior of a man everyone truly, deeply trusted. And Ponzi spent the money exactly the way you'd expect a man to spend money he'd been dreaming about since he was a broke boy in Rome trailing after rich university friends. He bought a mansion in Lexington, a wealthy suburb, and outfitted it with luxuries almost unheard of at the time: air conditioning, a heated swimming pool. He bought a locomobile, one of the most expensive and prestigious automobiles in America, and rode through Boston like visiting royalty. He wore beautiful suits, carried a gold-handled cane, kept a diamond stick pin at his throat, and fresh flowers in his lapel. He looked, deliberately, like exactly what he claimed to be: a financial genius who had cracked the code. But it wasn't all vanity, and this is where Ponzi stays complicated to the very end. With his new fortune, he brought his elderly mother across the Atlantic from Italy, not in steerage, the way he'd come, but in a first-class stateroom, the grand arrival he felt the great Ponzi name deserved. He'd originally bought 2 first-class tickets for a delayed honeymoon with Rose, and instead gave up the trip to bring his mother over in style. She came and lived with him and Rose in the Lexington mansion. She got to see her son as the triumphant man she'd always insisted the family was meant to produce, the fallen aristocracy restored at last. And then, not long after arriving in America to witness his glory, she died. She never lived to see it collapse. Depending on how you look at it, that was the one genuine mercy in the whole story. He gave money away too, publicly and lavishly. He pledged $100,000 to an Italian children's home in honor of his late mother. He tipped extravagantly, helped people, played the beloved benefactor of the immigrant community. The donuts he'd hand out to the anxious crowds weren't a one-off stunt. They were an expression of the role he'd been auditioning for his whole life: the big man, the generous prince, the local boy who made good and remembered where he came from. And then he made his most ambitious move of all, the one that reveals what he was really after. Then came the Hanover Trust Company again, the bank that had refused to lend him money back when he was nobody. Ponzi started depositing his flood of cash into that very bank, and he had a plan for it. Once his account was large enough, he intended to seize control, to impose his will on the bank that had rejected him, maybe even to make himself its president. After depositing something like $3 million, he and a group of associates bought a controlling interest in Hanover Trust. The poetry of that is almost too neat. The ex-con they wouldn't give a loan to now owned the bank. The dishwasher who slept on a restaurant floor now sat in the boardroom. In under a year, Charles Ponzi had gone from a man who served an extra month in prison over a $50 fine to a man who controlled a bank, a mansion, a fleet of offices, and the adoration of an entire city. It was, by any measure, one of the most spectacular rises in American history, and it was built, entirely, on a foundation of exactly nothing, because underneath all of it, the mansion, the locomobile, the bank, the worshipful crowds, there was supposed to be a business. There were supposed to be coupons. Mountains of coupons, oceans of them, generating the legendary profits that justified every promise. And there weren't. There almost never had been. And the moment anyone actually sat down and did the math, the entire glittering cathedral was going to come down. The math is the most damning part of the whole story. Chapter 9. The Arithmetic of the Impossible. One fact should have stopped Charles Ponzi before he ever collected a second dollar, and it's the same fact that makes his success so unsettling. The scheme wasn't a good idea run badly. It could never have worked at all. Not a little. Not with better management or a bit more time. The core of it was physically, mathematically, logistically impossible, and any competent person who spent an afternoon with the numbers could see it. The tragedy of 1920 is that, for months, nobody with the authority to stop him bothered to do the afternoon's work. So take Ponzi's story completely at face value and follow the arithmetic where it leads. Start with the very first group, those 18 investors in January 1920, who handed over $1,800, expecting 50% profit. To generate that profit legitimately, the way Ponzi claimed, he would have had to buy postal replete coupons in a cheap currency country and redeem them in America for the arbitrage gain. Fine. How many coupons would it take to honestly produce the returns owed on just that first $1,800? Roughly 53,000 coupons. For $1,800. From 18 people. Now scale that up. By the summer, Ponzi didn't have 18 investors. He had something like 15,000 or more, and rising fast, with millions upon millions of dollars flooding in. To honestly cover the returns he'd promised all of them, the number of coupons required wasn't in the thousands or the hundreds of thousands. To physically move that many coupons from Europe to the United States, you would have needed to fill ocean liners with them. Titanic-sized ships, packed hull to deck with little slips of postal paper, sailing across the Atlantic. That's not a figure of speech. That's the literal physical volume of paper the scheme would have required. It gets worse. When the financial journalist Clarence Barron finally examined the operation, he calculated that to back the investments Ponzi had taken in, roughly 160 million postal replica coupons would have to be in circulation worldwide. So how many actually existed in the entire global postal system at that time? About 27,000. 160 million needed, 27,000 in existence. Ponzi's scheme required roughly 6,000 times more coupons than existed on planet Earth. The United States Post Office confirmed the obvious. Nobody was buying these coupons in bulk, at home or abroad. There was no giant coupon operation. There couldn't be. The raw material for the fortune simply did not exist in the necessary quantities anywhere in the world. And when investigators finally got into Ponzi's operation and looked for the coupons, the actual physical evidence of the actual business that supposedly justified the whole empire, do you know how many dollars worth of postal replica coupons they found in his possession? By the accounts that came out of the investigation, about $61 worth. 61. That was, reportedly, the entire physical inventory of the business that had taken in millions. A man with a mansion, a bank, and a heated pool, whose supposed core business was postal coupons, held almost no postal coupons at all. But grant even more. Pretend the coupons did exist in unlimited supply. There's still a killer problem, and it's the boring one, the one Ponzi's dazzling story was designed to make you forget: overhead. Each coupon was worth a tiny amount and had to be purchased individually, shipped individually, and redeemed individually, one at a time, over the counter, at post offices. The sheer cost of the labor, the shipping, the handling, the endless clerk standing at endless windows cashing in slips of paper worth pennies, all of it would have devoured any theoretical profit long before it reached an investor. The gross margin looked spectacular on a single coupon. The net, once you accounted for the crushing real-world cost of operating at that scale, was a black hole. The arbitrage that looked so brilliant in theory was worthless in practice, strangled by its own logistics. And the record makes one more thing clear. Ponzi himself came to understand at least this much. By his own later account, he realized that actually converting the coupons into cash on any meaningful scale was logistically impossible. He knew, and it didn't matter, because he never needed the coupons. The coupons were the story, and the story was the product. As long as new money kept flooding in faster than old obligations came due, the machine ran beautifully. He didn't need a real business. He needed a plausible reason for people to hand him money and a steady supply of people willing to do it. That's the terrible elegance of what's now called a Ponzi scheme, and why it deserves its own name. It doesn't require a genius. It doesn't require a real investment, or a real product, or a real anything. It requires exactly two things: a story good enough to make people want to believe, and an ever-growing flood of new victims to pay the old ones. It is a machine that converts human hope and human greed directly into one man's fortune, and it works flawlessly, right up until the moment the flood of new victims slows down. Because the instant new money stops arriving faster than old money must be paid out, the entire structure inverts and collapses under its own impossible weight, all at once. Ponzi's flood was cresting in July of 1920, and that summer, three very different people, a furniture dealer with a grudge, a financial journalist with a sharp pencil, and an honest publicist with a conscience, were about to slow it down, then stop it, then bury him. Chapter 10. The First Cracks. Every collapse has a first crack, and Ponzi's story has a wonderful irony. The man was so successful at intimidating his critics that for a while he made himself untouchable, and that very success is what started to draw the fatal attention. When a Boston financial writer had the nerve to suggest, in print, that there was simply no legal way Ponzi could deliver the returns he was promising, Ponzi didn't argue the finance. He sued. He sued for libel, and, incredibly, he won, walking away with a reported $500,000 in damages. Under the libel laws of the time, the burden of proof sat on the writer and the publisher, not on Ponzi. So a critic who was in fact completely correct got financially crushed for saying so. And the lesson the entire Boston press absorbed was chilling. Attack Ponzi and he'll take everything you have. For a crucial stretch, that libel victory functioned as a force field, scaring off serious scrutiny and letting the scheme grow unchecked. Being right was not enough. Being right could ruin you. But money attracts lawsuits the way light attracts moths, and the next crack came from a completely unglamorous source, a furniture dealer named Joseph Daniels. Daniels had supplied Ponzi with furniture back before the fortune, furniture Ponzi hadn't been able to pay for at the time. Now, watching his former deadbeat customer ride around in a locomobile, Daniels decided he wanted a piece of the gold rush and sued. The lawsuit itself went nowhere. But it did something far more dangerous than winning ever could have. It made people ask the question, out loud, in public. How exactly had this man, who a year ago couldn't pay a furniture bill, become one of the richest men in Boston? Where was the money actually coming from? The Daniels suit put a crack of doubt into the public mood, and that doubt triggered the first real run on the Securities Exchange Company. Some investors got nervous and demanded their money back. And Ponzi did the only thing he could do, which happened to be the perfect thing. He paid them. Instantly, cheerfully, in full. He had oceans of incoming cash, remember, so covering a small run was easy, and paying off the nervous ones had a magical effect. It proved he was solid. Look, he pays. There's nothing to worry about. The run stopped. Confidence came roaring back, stronger than before. Every crisis he survived made him look more invincible. Then came the moment that should have been his greatest triumph and turned out to be the beginning of the end. On July 24, 1920, the Boston Post, the biggest newspaper in the city, ran a glowing, favorable front-page article about Ponzi and his miraculous scheme. To Ponzi, this was validation from the establishment itself, and the public reacted exactly as you'd expect. The article brought investors flooding in faster than ever. The next business day, Ponzi arrived at his office to find thousands of Bostonians waiting to throw money at him. This was the peak. $250,000 a day. The absolute zenith of Charles Ponzi. But that same favorable article carried the seed of his destruction, in two ways. First, in a detail so perfect it sounds invented. Right below the article praising Ponzi's 50% in 45 days returns sat a routine bank advertisement, offering a 5% return per year. The contrast was so absurd, so stark, printed right there on the same page, that it planted a quiet question in every thoughtful reader's mind. How can one man beat the bank by a factor of, 100? And second, more importantly, the article put Ponzi squarely on the radar of the newspaper's own leadership. Because while the Post's business side was happy to run a flattering story, the acting publisher, a sharp young man named Richard Grozier, running the paper while his father was away, was not so easily charmed. Grozier and his city editor smelled something wrong, and they decided to do the thing nobody had successfully done yet. They decided to investigate. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. Richard Grozier assigned reporters to dig into Ponzi, and simultaneously, the machinery of official Massachusetts was finally stirring. State authorities had begun their own inquiry. On the very day the Post ran its favorable article, Ponzi met with state officials, and here you see the con man's genius for improvisation at its absolute peak. He knew his books were a disaster. There were no real books, not in any honest sense. His entire accounting system amounted to a box of index cards with investors' names scribbled on them. If the state auditors dug in, they'd find nothing but chaos and fraud. So Ponzi made them a magnanimous offer. He volunteered, generously, cooperatively, like a man with nothing to hide, to stop accepting new investments during the state's investigation. Wasn't that reasonable? Wasn't that the conduct of an honest man? It was a brilliant stall. It temporarily calmed the official's suspicions and bought him time. But it was also, secretly, a knife at his own throat, because the entire scheme depended on new money constantly flooding in. The moment Ponzi stopped taking new investments, he cut off the fuel supply to his own machine. Every day he wasn't taking in fresh cash was a day closer to being unable to pay the people cashing out. He'd bought himself breathing room at the cost of the very oxygen he needed to survive. Meanwhile, the Post brought in a genuine expert, the sharpest financial mind they could find. His name was Clarence W. Barron, and he was no ordinary journalist. Barron headed Dow Jones and Company. His name still lives on today in Barron's, the financial magazine. This was a man who understood money at a level Ponzi's dazzled investors never could, and Barron looked at the Securities Exchange Company and started, methodically, taking it apart. His first observation was devastating in its simplicity. Ponzi was promising the public these astronomical returns. So where, Barron asked, was Ponzi's own money invested? A man who had truly discovered a legal machine that doubled money every 90 days would, logically, pour every cent he had into it. But Ponzi wasn't investing in his own scheme. He was putting his personal money into banks and real estate, into safe, ordinary, boring, legitimate things that paid normal returns. If even Ponzi didn't trust Ponzi's investment, why should anyone? Then Barron did the arithmetic we already walked through, the 160 million coupons that would need to exist versus the 27,000 that actually did. He laid it out plainly for the readers of the Post, and he added a final, almost philosophical dagger. Even if Ponzi somehow were doing exactly what he claimed, it would be immoral to invest with him, because the profit would be coming at the direct expense of some government's postal treasury. Either way, Barron concluded, you were dealing with something rotten. The Post ran Barron's analysis, and it triggered another panic run. Investors mobbed the office demanding their money, and Ponzi, magnificent showman to the last, met the panic head-on. He paid out around $2 million in 3 days to the anxious crowds, and he worked that crowd, the coffee and donuts scene, the image we opened with. He strolled among the frightened people, calm as a summer morning, passing out refreshments, cracking jokes, radiating absolute serene confidence. And it worked. Again. Many people who'd come to withdraw their money watched this unbothered little man in his straw hat and changed their minds. If he's this relaxed, they reasoned, everything must be fine. They left their money in. Some even invested more. It was the greatest performance of his life, and it was killing him. Because every dollar he paid out to stop the run was a dollar he'd never get back, and he'd voluntarily shut off the inflow, and the whole desperate spectacle had now attracted the attention of the one kind of person Ponzi couldn't charm his way past, a federal prosecutor. Daniel Gallagher, the United States Attorney for Massachusetts, had seen enough. He commissioned an auditor named Edwin Pride to go through the Securities Exchange Company's books and determine, once and for all, whether Ponzi was solvent. It was a maddening job. Pride was trying to audit a multi-million-dollar operation whose entire record-keeping consisted of index cards. But he started digging, and the number he was going to arrive at would be the end of everything. And then, into this closing trap, walked the single most important figure in Ponzi's downfall. A man Ponzi himself had hired. A man Ponzi was paying, out of his own pocket, to protect him. And that man was about to become his executioner. Chapter 12. The Honest Publicist. As the pressure mounted and the newspapers circled, Ponzi decided he needed help managing his public image. On the advice of his attorney, on July 23, 1920, he hired a professional publicist, a seasoned Boston newspaperman turned public relations man named William McMasters. It was the worst decision Charles Ponzi ever made, because William McMasters, it turned out, was that rarest and most inconvenient of hires, an honest man. McMasters came in to do a simple job: polish the Ponzi image, feed friendly stories to the press, keep the golden goose looking golden. But McMasters was a professional. To do his job, he needed access to Ponzi, to the operation, to the paperwork, and the closer he looked, the more alarmed he became. He listened to Ponzi talk, endlessly, about postal reply coupons, and something didn't add up. Literally didn't add up. This supposed financial titan, McMasters realized, didn't actually seem to understand his own business, couldn't explain the mechanics, couldn't do the math. McMaster's private assessment of his own client became one of the most quoted verdicts in the history of American fraud. Charles Ponzi, he said flatly, was a financial idiot. The man could hardly add. And McMaster's painted an unforgettable picture of the great financier at work, sitting with his feet up on the desk, smoking expensive cigars out of a diamond holder, talking complete gibberish about postal coupons. That was the genius. That was the man tens of thousands of people had entrusted with their life savings, a small-time charmer, with his feet on the desk, who couldn't do arithmetic, wrapped in a story, just clever enough to hide the emptiness underneath. Then, McMaster's found the documents. Working inside the operation, he came across paperwork that removed any doubt, the incriminating evidence that proved Ponzi was, exactly as the old phrase went, robbing Peter to pay Paul. There was no coupon fortune. There was just a river of new money being used to pay off old promises. His own client was a fraud, and McMaster's was now holding the proof. Now put yourself in McMaster's shoes. You've been hired and paid to protect this man. You have discovered he's a crook who is ruining thousands of ordinary families. What do? The easy, profitable, self-protective thing is to keep quiet, take your fee, and walk away before it blows up. McMaster's did the opposite. He took the evidence to his former employer, Richard Grozier at the Boston Post, and told him everything. Grozier understood exactly what he was holding, a bombshell, sourced from Ponzi's own paid insider. He offered McMaster's $5,000 for the story, and on August 2, 1920, the Boston Post published McMaster's exposé across its pages. The publicist Ponzi had hired to save him now declared, in print, for the whole city to read, that Charles Ponzi was hopelessly insolvent. That while Ponzi claimed to be sitting on millions in liquid funds, he was in reality at least $2 million in debt, and with interest obligations factored in, the hole ran as deep as $4.5 million. This was the punch that finally connected. This wasn't a rival newspaper, or a jealous furniture dealer, or a critic Ponzi could sue. This was Ponzi's own man, his own publicist, turning on him with documents. The story touched off a massive run, and Ponzi, incredibly, paid it off again, in a single frantic day, still performing, still smiling. The reporting would later be recognized as a landmark of American investigative journalism, part of the work that brought the Boston Post lasting acclaim. But its immediate effect was simpler. It had, at last, shattered the spell. Ponzi was now trapped between converging forces: a federal prosecutor's audit, a state investigation, a hostile press armed with insider proof, and a bank commissioner who was beginning to realize that this one man's collapse might drag down the entire Boston banking system. The performance couldn't hold much longer, and over the next 11 days, everything Charles Ponzi had built came apart, piece by piece, in public. Chapter 13. 11 Days. The end, when it came fast, and it came from the one direction Ponzi's charm couldn't reach: the cold machinery of banking regulation. Massachusetts Bank Commissioner Joseph Allen had been watching with growing dread. He wasn't worried only about Ponzi's investors. He was worried about the entire financial system. Ponzi controlled Hanover Trust. If a full-blown panic hit and investors drained Ponzi's accounts, it could crater the bank, and a failing bank could set off a chain reaction across Boston. Allen's alarm sharpened when he discovered something suspicious. A cluster of Ponzi-controlled accounts had received more than $250,000 in loans from Hanover Trust, the very bank Ponzi controlled. Why would a man supposedly sitting on millions need to borrow heavily from his own bank? The answer was obvious to Allen, because the millions weren't there. Ponzi was nowhere near as well financed as he pretended. Allen ordered bank examiners to watch Ponzi's accounts like hawks. On August 9th, the examiners reported back. So many investors had cashed checks against Ponzi's main account that it was severely overdrawn. The well was running dry. Allen acted immediately, ordering Hanover Trust to stop honoring any more checks from Ponzi's main account. He also helped orchestrate an involuntary bankruptcy filing by a group of small Ponzi investors. The trap was tightening from every side. That same day, The state attorney general announced there was little evidence to support Ponzi's claims of any large-scale coupon dealing, and invited Ponzi's note holders to come to the Massachusetts State House and register their names, so the investigation could tally the damage. And that same day, Ponzi got an advance look at Auditor Edwin Pride's findings. The number was catastrophic. Ponzi was at least $7 million in debt. On August 11th, the Boston Post fired its final shell, and it was a devastating one. On the front page, the paper laid out Ponzi's hidden past, the forgery conviction in Montreal more than a decade earlier, and his role in the scandal-ridden collapse of Zerossi's bank. The mysterious financial genius was revealed as a twice-imprisoned ex-convict who had personally witnessed and then replicated the exact robbing Peter to pay Paul scheme that had just been used to fleece all of Boston. The mask was completely off. That very afternoon, Commissioner Allen seized Hanover Trust outright, citing a mess of irregularities, and in doing so, he accidentally slammed shut Ponzi's last escape hatch. Because Ponzi's final, desperate plan had been to tap the bank's own vaults as a last resort if everything else failed. Now the bank was in government hands, and that door was bolted. His certificate of deposit at Hanover, once worth $1.5 million, got drained down to cover overdrafts. Even if Ponzi liquidated everything he had, he'd be left with maybe $4 million in assets against $7 million and climbing in debt. The arithmetic that had always been impossible was now simply, undeniably fatal. With reports swirling that his arrest was imminent, Charles Ponzi did the same thing he'd done in a Montreal police station a dozen years before. He surrendered. On August 12, 1920, he turned himself in to federal authorities and accepted the auditor's grim figures. He was charged with mail fraud, specifically for using the U.S. mail to send his investors notices that their notes had matured, letters that lured them deeper into the fraud. He was released on bail, immediately rearrested on state larceny charges, and posted more bail. Then, as the full audit results came out, his own bail bondsman got spooked that Ponzi might flee the country and withdrew the federal bail, sending him back behind bars. The wreckage was staggering. Beyond Hanover Trust, the collapse is generally reckoned to have dragged down 5 more banks: Ponzi's investors, the immigrants, the widows, the newsboys, the police officers, the ordinary families who'd mortgaged their homes on a dream, were practically wiped out. When the estates were finally settled, they recovered only a fraction of what they'd put in, by most accounts less than 30 cents on the dollar. All told, Ponzi's scheme had cost his investors around $20 million in 1920 money, hundreds of millions in today's terms, vanished in a matter of months. And one detail captures the man's bottomless showmanship, even at the edge of ruin. As Ponzi emerged from the State House during those final days, a crowd gathered, and even now, even as the truth poured out, some of them cheered him. Someone called out that he was the greatest Italian of them all. And Ponzi, ever the performer, waved the compliment away. "No, no," he said modestly. "Columbus and Marconi were greater. Columbus discovered America, Marconi discovered the wireless." And from somewhere in that crowd, a voice shot back the line that would follow him forever. "But you discovered money." He laughed. Of course he laughed. Even wiped out, even exposed, even facing prison, Charles Ponzi could not resist a good show. But the show was over. And now came the long, grinding reckoning, the years of courtrooms, cells, and one last, almost unbelievable attempt to run the whole con again. Chapter 14. The Long Arm of the Law. The legal saga that followed Ponzi's collapse stretched on for years and wound all the way to the highest court in the land. And it reveals a man who, even cornered, even guilty, never stopped talking, never stopped scheming, and never quite stopped believing he could talk his way out. The federal government hit him with 2 indictments totaling 86 counts of mail fraud. 86. He faced the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. His wife Rose, loyal, devastated Rose, urged him to stop fighting. And so, on November 1st, 1920, Ponzi pleaded guilty to a single count before a federal judge named Clarence Hale. Judge Hale, before pronouncing sentence, made clear the stakes reached beyond one man. The world could not be allowed to believe that a scheme like this could be pulled off without serious punishment. He sentenced Ponzi to 5 years in federal prison. Ponzi served about 3.5 years of that federal sentence, and when he walked out, expecting freedom, he got a nasty surprise. The state of Massachusetts was waiting with its own charges, 22 counts of larceny. Ponzi was stunned. He believed he'd had an understanding, plead guilty to the federal charges, and the state would leave him alone. Now the state was coming after him for what he saw as the same crime, and he cried foul. Double jeopardy, he argued. You can't try a man twice for the same offense. He fought it all the way to the United States Supreme Court in a case called Ponzi versus Fessenden, and in 1922, the court ruled against him on a principle that still matters in American law today. A plea bargain with federal prosecutors, the court held, has no binding power over state prosecutors. They're separate sovereigns. And it wasn't double jeopardy, because the state was charging him with larceny while the federal government had charged him with mail fraud. Different crimes, different jurisdictions, even if they sprang from the same rotten scheme. Charles Ponzi, con man, had accidentally made a small, permanent mark on American constitutional law. Then came the state trials, and here, Ponzi gave a performance that tells you everything about his terrifying gift. He was broke, genuinely insolvent, so he couldn't afford a lawyer. He represented himself, and standing before a jury, with no legal training, speaking as persuasively as he'd once spoken to the crowds handing him their savings, Charles Ponzi talked 12 ordinary citizens into acquitting him on the first 10 larceny counts. Not guilty. The man was demonstrably a fraud who had ruined thousands of people, and he charmed a jury into letting him walk. That's how good he was. The state tried again on more counts. The second jury deadlocked, couldn't agree. It took a third trial before prosecutors finally got a conviction. This time the court was blunt about who he was, sentencing him as a common and notorious thief to an additional 7 to 9 years in state prison. But between the appeals and the bail, Ponzi got a window of freedom in 1925, and he used it to do the single most audacious thing in his entire audacious life. Out on bail while appealing his state conviction, most men would lie low and pray. Charles Ponzi fled to Florida and started a brand new scam. The Florida land boom was raging, a speculative frenzy where people were buying and flipping Florida real estate sight unseen, convinced values could only go up. Ponzi saw a crowd of eager, greedy dreamers, which was the only raw material he ever needed. He set up the Charpon Land Syndicate, Charpon, a mashup of his own name, and started selling investors small tracts of Florida land with a familiar promise: 200% returns in 60 days. The pitch was pure Ponzi. The land was another matter. Much of it was worthless. Some of the prime Florida real estate he was selling was, quite literally, underwater swampland. He was selling swamp to people and promising them they'd triple their money in 2 months. It was the same trick, in a new costume, and it collapsed the same way. Florida authorities indicted him in 1926 for violating the state's trust and securities laws. A jury found him guilty, and a judge sentenced him to a year in Florida state prison. Ponzi appealed and got out on a small bond, and then made his run. He fled to Tampa, shaved his head, grew a mustache, and signed on as a crewman aboard a merchant ship bound for Italy, trying to slip out of the country and vanish. And he almost made it, except that Charles Ponzi could never stop talking. He revealed his true identity to a shipmate. Word spread. A deputy sheriff got wind of it, tracked the ship to its last American port in New Orleans, and arrested him there. The great confidence man, undone one final time by his own need to be known. From a New Orleans jail, Ponzi played his last cards. He appealed to President Calvin Coolidge for deportation. He appealed to Benito Mussolini, the dictator of his native Italy, to take him in. Both ignored him. There was nowhere left to run and no one left to charm. He was sent back to Massachusetts to finish serving his sentence, 7 more years behind bars. Chapter 15. Exile. Ponzi was finally released from prison in 1934. He was in his early 50s now. 14 years had passed since the summer he ruled Boston, and almost every one of them had been spent behind bars, in courtrooms, or on the run. The straw hat and the locomobile, and the heated pool belonged to another lifetime. And freedom, when it finally came with a condition that broke whatever was left of the American dream that had carried a broke 21-year-old across the Atlantic 3 decades earlier. He was to be deported, immediately, back to Italy. He fought even this. He begged the governor of Massachusetts, Joseph Ely, for a full pardon. On July 13, 1934, the governor refused. Ponzi had no more moves, and when he walked out through the prison gates for the last time on American soil, the charisma that had once made crowds cheer him as the greatest Italian of them all was simply gone. There were no adoring investors now. Instead, an angry crowd was waiting. People who remembered exactly what he'd cost them and their neighbors. The showman had no show left. He told the waiting reporters, with a kind of exhausted honesty that his younger self would never have allowed, "I went looking for trouble, and I found it." On October 7, 1934, Charles Ponzi was officially deported. He sailed away from the United States, the country he'd dreamed of, conquered and disgraced, and he would never see it again. Rose did not go with him. She had never wanted to leave Boston, and in any case Ponzi was in no position to support her, or anyone. She stayed in America, and in 1936, after nearly 2 decades bound to a man who'd given her a mansion and then a lifetime of scandal and separation, she filed for divorce, and it was finalized the following year. Asked about it by a reporter, she summed up her loyalty with quiet dignity. Through the trouble and the prison and the millions and the ruin, she said, she had stuck by him and felt she had proved herself through thick and thin. It's hard not to feel for her. She had married him knowing his past, stood by him through the collapse and the trials and the endless imprisonment, and in the end, there was simply nothing left to stand by. The one genuinely stable, loving thing in Ponzi's life dissolved quietly, an ocean away. Back in Italy, Ponzi tried to do the only thing he knew how to do. He jumped from scheme to scheme, hustle to hustle, chasing the next big idea the way he always had. But the magic was gone. Italy in the 1930s was not 1920 Boston. The gullible crowds and the flood of easy money never materialized. Nothing he touched caught fire. Eventually, through connections to Mussolini's fascist government, he landed a real job as a manager for an Italian state airline operating in Brazil. He moved to Rio de Janeiro. For a while, it was something like stability, a legitimate position, a paycheck, a place in the world. But then the Second World War arrived, and it swept away even this last modest foothold. Brazil eventually sided with the Allies. British intelligence worked to shut down the Italian airlines operations in the country, and Ponzi's job simply disappeared. He was, once again, a man in a foreign country with no money and no prospects. The very condition he'd spent his entire life running from, now permanent, and now inescapable. During these final years, adrift in Brazil, Ponzi did something poignant. He wrote his autobiography. The man who had spent his life curating his own legend sat down to tell his own story one last time, in his own words. He scraped by as a translator when he could find the work, trading on the languages that had once helped him charm his way into a Montreal bank. And his health, which he'd once literally given pieces of away to a stranger, began to fail him completely. He suffered a heart attack. His eyesight went. He became blind in one eye. He was partly paralyzed. The dapper little showman with the gold-handled cane was now a sick, poor, aging man in a charity hospital ward, far from Italy, far from Boston, far from everything he'd ever wanted. On January 18, 1949, Charles Ponzi died in the charity ward of a hospital in Rio de Janeiro. He was 66 years old. He left behind an estate valued at $75, just barely enough to pay for his own burial. $75. The man who had taken in $1 million a day, who had controlled a bank and owned a mansion with a heated pool, who had held the savings of an entire city in his hands, died with $75 to his name. The $2.50 immigrant had come almost exactly full circle. But in his final days, giving one last interview, Ponzi was still Ponzi. Looking back on the whole spectacular catastrophe of his life, he offered a reflection that is either shameless or strangely honest, depending on how you hear it. Even if his investors never got anything for their money, he said, It was cheap at the price, because, without meaning any real harm, he had given them the best show that had ever been staged in their part of the world since the Pilgrims landed. It was worth $15 million, he figured, just to watch him put the whole thing over. And in perhaps his most honest sentence ever, speaking to a reporter near the end, he stripped away all the talk of coupons and genius and finally named exactly what he'd done. My business, he said, was simple. It was the old game of robbing Peter to pay Paul. The old game, the one he'd learned in Montreal, the one he'd die knowing he'd played better, and more famously, than anyone in history. Chapter 16. The People He Left Behind. It's easy, telling a story like this, to get swept up in the spectacle, the millions, the mansion, the Supreme Court, the disguises, and the getaway ship. The con man is always the most vivid figure in the frame. But before we talk about legacy and immortality, spend a moment on the people who don't get statues or nicknames or Wikipedia pages, the ones who paid for the show. That phrase, less than 30 cents on the dollar, had a human meaning. It wasn't an abstraction on a balance sheet. It was a family that had mortgaged the house, put the literal roof over their children's heads on the line, and got back pennies against the dollar, with the mortgage still due and nothing to pay it with. Somewhere else it was a widow who'd handed over the money her husband left her, the only thing between her and destitution, watching most of it evaporate. Newspaper boys lost their small hoards of coins. Working immigrants who'd trusted Ponzi precisely because he was one of their own, learned the hardest possible lesson about what that trust was worth. Many of these people had reinvested, again and again, rolling their fortunes forward, which meant that on paper they'd been richest of all right before they lost nearly everything. The higher the paper fortune had climbed, the further the real fall. And the ripple didn't stop at Ponzi's own investors. When the other banks went down alongside Hanover Trust, they took other people's money with them, ordinary depositors who'd never invested a dime with Ponzi, who'd simply had the misfortune of banking at an institution he'd poisoned. That's the thing about a fraud this size. It doesn't stay inside the circle of the greedy or the gullible. It spreads outward, into the accounts of people who never gambled on anything, who just happened to be standing too close when it blew. The people who stopped him fared strangely too, and history has a dark sense of humor about it. Take William McMasters, the honest publicist whose conscience broke the whole thing open. He'd done the right thing. He'd turned on his own client, warned the public, and helped expose one of the great frauds of the age. And how was he rewarded? Ponzi, of course, never properly paid him for his publicity work, so McMasters sued to collect his fee. And he lost. A judge ruled that McMasters couldn't collect, because in the course of the job he'd effectively served two masters, Ponzi and the public, and so wasn't entitled to the money. The man who exposed Ponzi got stiffed by Ponzi and then lost in court trying to recover it. Doing the right thing, it turned out, came with a bill. The Boston Post and Richard Grozier, on the other hand, earned lasting glory. Their dogged investigation, bringing in Clarence Barron, buying McMasters' story, running the exposés day after day even after Ponzi had won a crushing libel suit against another critic, became a celebrated chapter in the history of American investigative journalism, the kind of fearless, mathematical, public interest reporting that newspapers exist to do. It's a reminder that the tools that finally beat Ponzi weren't glamorous. They were a sharp pencil, a willingness to do the boring arithmetic, and the courage to print the answer. And then there's Rose Gnecco, who married him knowing his past, who stood by him through the collapse and the trials and 14 years of prison, who lost the mansion and the fortune, and finally, an ocean apart from him, quietly ended the marriage as the 1930s wore on. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply loved the wrong man and believed, the way so many of his victims believed, that the charming, generous, optimistic person in front of her was the whole truth. She spent the rest of her life in the shadow of a name that had become a punchline and a warning. Of all the people Charles Ponzi took something from, Rose may have given the most freely and gotten the least back. So when we marvel at Ponzi, and he is, undeniably, a marvel, these people belong in the frame beside him. The show he was so proud of, the show he called the best ever staged, was paid for entirely by them. Every laugh he got from that crowd, every cheer, Every donut he handed out with that untroubled smile. The whole performance ran on their hope and their savings and their trust. That's the part the nickname leaves out. Chapter 17. Why we still say his name. One question outlives Charles Ponzi. The puzzle at the center of his strange immortality. He did not invent the scheme that carries his name. He didn't even do it first. So why him? Why does the entire world, in every language, call this particular fraud a Ponzi scheme? Because he really wasn't the original. Long before Boston went mad, other people had run the exact same con. Around 1880, a Boston woman named Sarah Howe ran the Ladies' Deposit Company, taking money from women with the promise of impossible interest, some 8% a month, paying the early depositors with the later ones cash, and eventually landing in prison, only to resurface with fresh schemes after her release. 2 decades later, in 1899, a young Brooklyn bookkeeper named William Miller pulled the same trick so successfully that he earned the nickname 520% Miller for the absurd returns he dangled. Miller took in something on the order of $1 million, a staggering sum for the time, using precisely the mechanism Ponzi would later make famous. A number of accounts suggest Ponzi may even have drawn inspiration from Miller's example. The rob Peter to pay Paul con is genuinely ancient. Versions of it appear in literature well before Ponzi was ever born, so the scheme was old. Ponzi just gave it a face. And there are a few reasons the name stuck to him and not to the others. The first is scale and spectacle. Nobody had ever run this con so big, so fast, and so publicly. $1 million a day. An entire city, from newsboys to Brahmins to 3/4 of the police force. A cluster of banks brought down. A Supreme Court case. The sheer operatic drama of Ponzi's rise and fall burned the story into the national memory in a way that Sarah Howe's quieter fraud never could. The crime was almost beside the point. Ponzi performed it, on the largest possible stage, in front of everyone. The second reason is the newspapers, and this is the darker part of the answer. Ponzi's collapse played out at the exact moment American journalism was becoming a mass, sensational, headline-driven force, and his name was a headline writer's gift. Short, punchy, memorable, and, crucially, unmistakably Italian. The 1920s were a period of ferocious anti-immigrant, and specifically anti-Italian, prejudice in America. Millions of Italians had poured into the country, and much of established society regarded them with open suspicion and contempt. In 1924, the country would pass a sweeping immigration law specifically designed to slam the door on newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe. In that climate, a swindler with an Italian surname was almost too perfect for a certain kind of newspaper. The foreign-sounding name carried an ugly, ready-made implication, and the press leaned into it. Sarah Howe and William Miller had plain Anglo names. Ponzi had a name that, to a prejudiced public, sounded like a foreign trickster. The bigotry of the era helped make his name the label, an uncomfortable truth folded into the story of how he became immortal. And the third reason is simply that the name was good. Ponzi scheme has a ring to it. 2 crisp syllables that sound almost playful, almost cartoonish, which is a strange fit for a crime that destroys lives. It rolled off the tongue, it fit in a headline, it stuck. But underneath the question of the name lies a far more important and disturbing question, the one that actually matters, the one that makes this century-old story urgently relevant to your life right now. Why does the scheme keep working? Ponzi did it. Then, over and over, for the next 100 years, people did it again, and got away with it again, and found no shortage of victims again. If the whole thing is mathematically impossible, if it always collapses, if we've had a name for it and a cautionary tale about it for a century, why do millions of people keep handing over their savings to the next Charles Ponzi? The answer isn't about arithmetic, it's about human nature, and it's the same today as it was in 1920. Chapter 18. The Anatomy of a Lie That Never Dies. The Ponzi scheme is eternal for a reason, and the reason isn't financial. It isn't really a financial exploit at all. It's a psychological one. It doesn't attack your bank account. It attacks the oldest and most exploitable features of the human mind. And once you see how it works, you'll recognize it everywhere, because it never went away. It just changes its costume. Start with the most obvious engine: greed. The promise of getting rich without working for it fires something deep and primal in us. Ponzi offered to double money in 90 days. Every scheme since has offered some version of the same impossible fruit. And greed makes people stupid in a very specific way. It makes them stop asking questions they'd normally ask, because the answers might spoil the dream. Nobody who desperately wants the 50% return wants to hear the boring math about postal coupons. The wanting comes first, and the wanting silences the doubt. But greed alone doesn't explain it, because plenty of Ponzi's victims weren't reckless gamblers. Many were cautious, ordinary people. For them, a second and quieter force did the work: the fear of missing out. When you watch your neighbor, your brother-in-law, your priest, your fellow officer on the force get rich, or appear to, staying out starts to feel like the reckless choice. Everyone else is doing it. Everyone else is winning. Are you really going to be the fool who stood on the sidelines? This is the terrible genius of the thing. The scheme weaponizes your own community against you. The more people who join, the safer it looks, when in reality every new member makes the eventual collapse larger and more certain. Which brings us to the mechanism social scientists call social proof, our deep, automatic tendency to assume that if lots of people are doing something, it must be safe and sound. We are herd animals. We use the behavior of the crowd as a shortcut for judgment, because most of the time it works. But a Ponzi scheme turns that instinct into a weapon. The crowd isn't a signal of safety. The crowd is the fuel. And the bigger and more enthusiastic the crowd gets, the more dangerous the thing actually becomes, the exact opposite of what our instincts tell us. Then there's the specific poison that both Ponzi and, decades later, Bernie Madoff exploited so effectively, what's known as affinity fraud. Con artists love to work inside tight-knit communities, an ethnic group, a religious congregation, a profession, a social circle. Ponzi was an Italian selling to Italians, one of us letting our people in on the secret. Madoff, generations later, moved largely within affluent Jewish communities and institutions, trusted because he was an insider, a member, a familiar face at the synagogue and the country club. Affinity fraud is uniquely vicious because the trust that binds a community, normally a beautiful thing, becomes the very channel through which the poison spreads. And victims are often slower to report it, because reporting means turning on your own community. Admitting your own circle was the source of your ruin. And finally, layered on top of all of it, is the power of a good story. Ponzi understood, maybe better than anyone before him, that people don't invest in spreadsheets, they invest in narratives. His postal coupon story was the perfect lie, complicated enough that ordinary people couldn't easily check it, exotic enough to sound like genuine hidden financial wizardry, and just true enough at its core. Arbitrage is real. The coupon loophole did technically exist, that a smart person could talk themselves into believing the rest. Every great financial fraud since has needed its own version of this story. Madoff had his mysterious, split-strike conversion strategy that he claimed generated steady, magical returns and that no one could quite explain. The details change. The function is identical. Give people a story impressive enough that admitting they don't understand it feels more embarrassing than just trusting the genius who claims he does. Held up against Bernie Madoff, the whole terrible lesson snaps into focus. Ponzi ran his scheme for a matter of months in 1920 and took his victims for around $20 million, a sum that, adjusted for a century of inflation, works out to somewhere in the hundreds of millions in today's money. Madoff ran the same con. New investors' money paid out as fake profits to earlier ones, no real trading underneath, for decades, right up until 2008, and when it collapsed, it had cost his investors something on the order of $18 billion. Even measured in comparable inflation-adjusted terms, that makes Madoff's fraud roughly 50 times the size of the original, and it was run by a man with a name so respectable he'd once chaired a stock exchange. A financial analyst named Harry Markopolos spent years trying to warn regulators that Madoff's returns were mathematically impossible, doing exactly the kind of pencil and paper arithmetic Clarence Barron had done in 1920. And for years, The authorities didn't listen. The same impossible math, the same warnings ignored, the same trusting victims, 88 years apart. That's the point. That's why this 100-year-old story about posting coupons still matters. Because the Ponzi scheme is not a relic. It is a permanent fixture of human finance, as durable as greed and trust and hope themselves. It reappears in every generation, wearing whatever costume the era finds most convincing. Post-it coupons in 1920, exotic Wall Street strategies in the 2000s, and, in our own time, all the glittering new frontiers where impossible returns get promised to hopeful people who don't quite understand the underlying machinery. The technology changes and the pitch gets updated, but the mathematics never do. New money pays old promises, until the new money slows, and then it all falls down. Every single time. Charles Ponzi didn't invent this, but he gave it its name, and in doing so he gave us something valuable, a permanent, one-word warning. When someone promises you returns that are too good to be true, steady, spectacular, guaranteed, and impossible to lose, and when you can't quite explain, in plain language, exactly where the profit actually comes from, a small alarm should sound in the back of your mind. And the word that alarm should say is Ponzi. Chapter 19. The best show ever staged. So what do we make of him in the end? Charles Ponzi, Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi, the boy with 5 names and a fallen family, born to a mother who insisted on being called Donna while the money ran out around her. He wanted one thing his entire life, and it's almost unbearably simple. He wanted his name to mean something. He grew up on stories of the family's lost greatness, sent to America to restore the name, driven by a hunger to be somebody, to be the great Ponzi his mother always insisted he was destined to be. The irony is cruel, and perfect enough to feel mythological. He got exactly what he wanted, and it destroyed everything he wanted it for. He made the name Ponzi immortal. He truly did. A century after his scheme collapsed, decades after he died penniless and half-blind in a Brazilian charity ward, his name is spoken every single day, all over the world, in courtrooms and classrooms and newsrooms and boardrooms. Most people who have never heard a single fact about his life, who couldn't tell you he was Italian, or that he came over with $2.50, or that he once gave away the skin off his own back, still know his name. He is more famous now than almost anyone who was alive in Boston in 1920. He achieved the immortality he craved. He just achieved it as a warning. The Ponzi name doesn't mean greatness or nobility or restored family honor. It means fraud, the beautiful lie, the trick that preys on hope. He spent his life trying to make his name a monument, and he made it a gravestone instead, his own, and the marker on every scheme like his that came after. And maybe that's the most honest way to see him. Not as a criminal mastermind. His own publicist called him a financial idiot who couldn't add, and there's real truth in that. Ponzi was not a genius of finance. He was a genius of performance. He understood people. He understood hope and greed and vanity and trust. And he understood how to give a crowd a story so intoxicating they'd hand him everything they had and thank him for the privilege. He was, above all, a showman, the little man in the straw hat, handing out coffee and donuts to the very people he was ruining, keeping the show going by sheer force of charm right up until the mathematics finally caught him. He knew it, too. At the very end, broke and forgotten and dying, he didn't describe himself as a financier or a victim or a misunderstood businessman. He described himself as an entertainer. Even if his investors never got a thing for their money, he said, they got the best show ever staged in their part of the world since the Pilgrims landed, worth $15 million just to watch him put it over. There's something chilling in that, and something almost disarmingly honest, because for one dizzy summer, that's what Boston thought it was buying. A miracle, a dream, a show, with the return as almost the least of it, and Charles Ponzi gave them the show of their lives. He just charged them their life savings for the ticket. The immigrant who arrived with $2.50 and $1 million in hopes died with $75 and no hopes left at all. In between, he became, for a few months, the most beloved man in Boston, and then the most notorious man in America. He rose higher and faster than almost anyone in the history of the country, on a foundation of absolutely nothing, and he fell just as far. And when it was all over, America looked at the wreckage of everything he'd built and destroyed, and it did the one thing that guaranteed he would never, ever be forgotten. Prison wasn't enough. Deportation wasn't enough. It took his name, the name he'd chased across an ocean, the name he'd committed every crime to elevate, and turned it into the word we now use for the oldest and most seductive lie in the history of money. Charles Ponzi wanted to be immortal. He got his wish. He just never got to choose what for.